Alrighty, so this is the study guide review for exam 2. Okay, so for chapter 6, I'm just looking at the risk factors for parent to adolescent maltreatment. So such as low warmth, conflicts between kids and children, if they use a lot of harsh discipline, that kind of stuff that it talks about within that section of the chapter. Risk factors for adolescent to parent maltreatment. So meaning that if you're a single parent, you're more likely to be maltreated by your adolescent, or if you're female. When it comes to sibling abuse, just that it's the physical, emotional, psychological, or sexual abuse of a brother or sister. Just the definition is what I'm looking for there. When it comes to sibling sexual abuse, just the fact that it's more common than parent to child sexual abuse is sibling sexual abuse. So learning theory, I'll use that sibling abuse is related to modeling or conditioning, meaning that you basically learn to commit violence by seeing it, so that's why you carry that out on your siblings. So maybe you see your parents, physically discipline your siblings, so you physically discipline your siblings. Feminist theory argues that sibling abuse is related to patriarchy, where males may feel the right to dominate women or use violence, right? Conflict theory looks at it differently. It talks about how if you're in a conflict, you're going to often use violence to resolve struggles. So, they argue that by parents often pitting siblings against each other, like sibling rivalry, that sometimes parents feed into that by favoring one child or the other, and that causes conflict, which can result in violence. As far as effects of family abuse on adolescent interpersonal relationships, just the idea that there's a lot of consequences that can come from experiencing this in their own relationships later. So, they might be more at risk for dating violence, right, as a result of, what they've experienced at home. Okay, so for chapter 7, let's see. Just basically saying that when we're talking about how dating violence works, it's just the perpetuation of physical, emotional, or a threat of abuse for people that are dating but not married. When it comes to jealousy, it's just the problem that a lot of people, especially college students, who are the target demo for dating violence, often think that jealousy means that someone cares about them or loves them, which is not positive. And then, as far as gender socialization, oftentimes because of this, when women are battering men, or if they're emotionally or psychologically or physically abusing men, it's not taken as seriously as when a man does it to a woman, right? Just feeding into that kind of patriarchal notions of society. So when it comes to hypermasculinity and power, that kind of also feeds into that, right? But hypermasculinity itself, it's just the idea that men's anger, or the idea that men are supposed to coerce women into sex or be aggressive, can feed into this kind of lack of empathy for women. So that's like kind of hypermasculinity itself. When it comes to consent, it's just the idea of you should have to give some sort of obvious acknowledgement of consent, but oftentimes that's not acknowledged as part of the sexual scripts. Um, let's see. Oh, there's also this issue that they talked about in the book, how people that commit sexual assault oftentimes don't have remorse for their crimes. They'll often don't see what they did as wrong, right? Also, when it comes to the rape myths, it's like often a lot of the blame, shifting blame to victims. So what comes with that is this idea that if a woman was dressed a certain way, if she was drinking, if she was this, or that somehow she's partially at fault for what happened to her. Let's see. So of course there's a lot of consequences to sexual assault, right? Like you can have injuries, negative health outcomes like STDs. Obviously, the psychological results of that could be PTSD, suicidal ideation, depression, all that kind of stuff. And oftentimes people change their behaviors as a result. So some people get very obsessive compulsive, right? And develop phobias. Some people have sexual dysfunctions as a result, or turn to drugs and alcohol to deal with their issues. And others use eating disorders in a similar way to drugs and alcohol to kind of try to reestablish control of their lives, right? So rapists are just the ideologies that blame victims for when they are sexually assaulted. All right, so the friend zone thing, all I was going for there is the idea that, often if a woman is friendly, if she smiles, if she makes eye contact, then that's perceived as sexual interest instead of being perceived as smiling and making eye contact. So there's this weird kind of situation where we call it the friend zone, right? But it's really kind of this entitlement thing to say that if a woman is friendly towards you, then, that the only reason that she would do that is if she wanted to have sex with you instead of maybe she's just friendly. Right, anyway. But it kind of comes from this, perceived like I'm being, like a disservice is happening to me because this person is only my friend, as in like men are only friends with women for sex, right? It was kind of the underlying ideology of that. When it comes to prevention, a lot of programming is focused on basically making women change their behavior, but not changing the behavior that leads to sexual assault. That's kind of a big problem. All right, when it comes to stalking childhood factors, that's just this idea of like, if you, are stalking someone, oftentimes that has to do with you needing some sort of control, right? So this can be a factor of having harsh parental discipline in your past that, you have like association or attachment problems as a result. And because of that, you tend to become very controlling. And yeah, obviously stalking is controlling, like monitoring someone's behaviors. When it comes to same-sex sexual assault, um, obviously we don't really know like statistics-wise as much as we should, but that this is still an issue that does occur. It's just that it becomes more difficult when police have to kind of try to, we're talking about how there's mandatory arrest in a lot of situations. Like, who do you arrest when the assumption of in a heteronormative frame is that if someone's experiencing DV, that a man is hitting a woman, even though we know that's not only the case, that it does go the other way as well. But there's still this kind of heteronormative spin on this whole thing, right? So it gets more complicated for same-sex victims who often are not taken seriously. We talked about how the FBI definition didn't even include male victims until pretty recently. So that's another issue. When it comes to cross-cultural DV, SA, and ST, really I'm just looking for the idea that, culture has an impact on how we understand dating violence, how we understand sexual assault, how we understand stalking, right? Different cultures have different meanings around relationships and dating and how that plays out. And of course, the other issue, though, too, when it comes to race and ethnicity with these issues is that most research is not looking at minority populations. So that means that there's a lot that's not known about minority populations when it, in regards to what are the specific things that they're facing, what are the specific context, what are the specific issues that they need to have addressed that are different from the overall, population. So there is a lack of research in that regard. That's a problem. All right, chapter 8. Blaming victims. Obviously that's kind of what we're talking about today. This idea that people are often blamed by their partner who doesn't understand that what they did is wrong, or that like they don't, abusers are often incapable of seeing their role in it. By society, right? By the larger culture that says, well, why do you stay? If you respected yourself, you would just leave, right? Those kind of things. By professionals, oftentimes, like we're talking about how even with shelter workers, 14% of them thought that, women asked for it in some regard, which is frightening. And then by themselves, right? Like Oftentimes, people that are the victims of this kind of violence turn this inward and start to try and like understand how, blame themselves for being in that situation. So, as far as consequences, we talked about this. This is the next slide. Just that, people experience a lot of fear, trauma, stress. PTSD is like the long term version of that, just as a result of experiencing a lot of this violence on a day to day basis. Let's see. When it comes to barriers to employment, it's very often that abusive partners will interfere with their victims' work lives. Like we talked about, hide their keys or, basically sabotage them so that they can't go to work, right? Like there's the example in the book that they gave, like that the guy cut off all of her hair so she would be too embarrassed to leave the house. And without money, without a financial support system, that takes out the ability for someone to leave and be able to get away, right? Let's see. Oh, law enforcement interactions. So those are obviously important because that can either help someone a lot or that can cause more barriers to them getting help. So it really depends on how police officers are trained and if they understand the dimensions of IPV. And this is again why there are specialized units like, again, we were talking about the fake like Law and Order SVU kind of thing today in class, but that it's the actual, there are units within the police that focus specifically on sex crimes with the idea that it takes you need a different approach and a different training and understanding to really address these issues. Let's see. Oh, the leave stay decision stuff. Oh man. So basically, this can be an issue too. Okay, going back to the police thing for a second too. The other problem with the law enforcement thing is that law enforcement often doesn't understand if a woman doesn't want to press charges or she doesn't want to testify or she doesn't want to whatever, right? The idea is that somehow that means the abuse didn't happen. But that's not true, right? The idea is that, maybe this person called the police because they wanted the violence to stop. They wanted to not be in threat of violence. But now that they are there, they don't want the person that's like the sole breadwinner for the family to be locked up. Or they're afraid that if he goes to jail that they're going to face a lot of, violent retaliation or those kind of things. So oftentimes they don't press charges. So then officers that aren't trained effectively take that as a sign that this person didn't either didn't commit the crime or that the woman doesn't care and is complicit, instead of seeing it as it's much more complicated than that, right? So there's a lot of barriers to people leaving their abuser, right? So those, we talked about that in class, the role expectations of like, the idea you got to stick it out to the bitter end, as Marge Simpson says, right? Obviously, people are being psychologically impacted by the abuse, so that's going to affect whether or not they're really in their right mind and making a, kind of logical leave or stay decision. If people have no money, then they lack the resources to get out. That's a huge part of it. And another one is just not having anywhere to go. If you can't envision leaving, it makes it a lot more difficult to put into action. So, let's see. So, part of the problem too is that when we assume a victim can just leave, then we almost engage in a victim blaming logic because we don't really understand that there's a lot of barriers that come between people being able to leave and when they make those decisions, being able to commit to that, right? So sometimes people go to shelters, but then they don't end up permanently relocating. They sometimes end up trying to reconcile with the abuser. So it's a complicated process. So if we just kind of assume that, oh, they can just leave, they just choose to stay, that becomes its own kind of entrapment, right? Because then we basically just assume that women are somehow at fault for that. When it comes to dangers of leaving an abusive partner, actually, there's often, a increase in the amount of physical violence that a victim faces when, basically, like there's a backlash from the person that's the abuser, because the victim's like, I'm leaving, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. So that can often kind of antagonize the abuser. And so there might be an increase in physical violence. Like a lot more people face, extreme violence and death when they're trying to leave. So again, it kind of flies in the face of that assumption that women just don't leave, that they're partially complicit in this. Emotional factors. I mean, obviously, it's a complicated situation that people are going through where they're trying to figure out like the pros and cons of leaving a relationship. So we talked about it briefly in class. The investment models, trying to understand how people rationalize that, how they look at what choices they have, and try and figure out whether they leave or not. And often that has to do with what alternatives they have, what's their financial situation, right? Do they have kids or not? Like those things make a difference in whether or not people leave or stay. And as far as male victims, I mean, obviously, it's, just kind of like what we were talking about in class, that it becomes this invisible problem because not only are there so few reported cases, even those that are reported are often not taken seriously, so they don't end up in the official statistics. And that kind of affects, this perception, this patriarchal perception that, men can physically dominate women. So if a man is physically dominated by a woman, that just goes against the societal assumptions of how that works. So, a lot of men are discouraged from reporting these things because they're not going to be taken seriously as victims. They're not going to be taken seriously as men. It challenges their social roles, so it's a problem. Alrighty, so as far as this is like the only test you're going to have to go over both of these books. So first, for The Child Called It, all I'm really looking for here is like, how did his dad react to the stabbing? With indifference, right? He assumed when his father saw what happened that he would immediately respond, that he would, call the police and this whole situation would end. And that's not what happened, right? Um, all I really want you to know for the prevalence of extreme punishment, like the kind of like torture chamber kind of stuff that she would do to him, um, it was really about control, right? It was really about her needing to control him and his behavior and just have that kind of power over him, right? So as far as how he changed emotionally when he became a preteen, he basically shut down, right? He started, he was a very, emotionally open child, but he really, shut down as he got to his, young adult years because, as a preteen especially, because that's not like that's a fun time period for anyone. That's a complicated time in anyone's life. And so because of the kind of stuff he was going through, he basically, like, as a survival technique, had to kind of cut himself off so that he could deal with what he was facing. As far as the teacher's role, all I was looking for there is this idea that, teachers are in classrooms with kids every day. They're a huge point of contact when it comes to understanding the lives and safety and comfort and, experiences of children. So it's important that we have these, mandatory laws and that they're trained so that they can see the signs of abuse and report it. Because, as we can learn from David's story, children are not often going to divulge this without anyone prodding them to do so, right? Just like in David's case, he was often coached to lie or to, basically cover up the fact that the abuse was taking place. So it's important for teachers, since they're dealing with kids every day, to, be able to keep an eye out for these kind of things. And that's like a really important line of defense in dealing with this issue. Okay, so as far as I'm Not Your Victim, the first one I'm looking at is her reaction to physical abuse in her first marriage, which is that she left, right? She did experience physical abuse in her first marriage, which is really interesting. But when it happened, she bailed. So it's really interesting that she didn't with her situation with Sam. Okay, so Sam's expectation of the role of wife, just this idea that like even the night she came home from the hospital after giving birth, he expected her to have sex with him because that was considered what? That's part of the role and expectations and duties of a wife, right? And you're like, yeah, but that's a very straining thing to have a bowling ball basically come out of your body. That's intense, right? So, he didn't care at all about that. He still expected her to have sex. He expected her to cook and clean the day that she got home after giving birth from the hospital. So that's just ridiculous. As far as his control, meaning that, he was very withholding of money. He would control who she talked to, where she went, what she did. And as far as the Vietnam thing, he convinced her to stage a suicide attempt to get him home from deployment in Vietnam. Clearly, that's insane. So as far as Cindy's influence, Cindy obviously it was a positive influence. She tried to convince her that she deserved better. She tried to build up her self-esteem. She helped her go back to school and provided her with a support system. So she was really like the rock that, Beth had. Okay, so then for the short answer essay questions, these are based on the I Am Not Your Victim. So what was the military bases hospital response to the abuse of Beth and Matt? Right? What was the police response? So just, give me, you don't have to go super into detail, but just explain the basic incident that happened and what their response was, like how helpful slash not helpful they were, basically. And then what does this say about the societal argument that women who stay with their abusers are complicit in abuse? Just basically showing that even though, we tend to think of people in that frame of being complicit, she went to the hospital, and if it wasn't taken as seriously as it should be, especially the abuse towards your child, and if the police didn't take the report seriously, then how much agency does she feel she has, or how likely does she feel that her issues will be addressed, right? So how much is she choosing to be in that situation if the hospital doesn't respond, if the police don't respond, right? And then for number two, how are her children affected by seeing incidents of IPV? So, kind of relating what's going on in chapters 5 through 7. How well does her story support the text? So, kind of go back, look at that. Actually, there's a couple places in the book that would refer to that, also in child abuse, but also, for those that are, witnessing or experiencing, the effects of, a parent going through IPV. But of course, also in chapter 8, they talk about that as well. So, I would just ask that you go through, look at how they describe what effects the children are facing, like how they're responding to that kind of situation, like emotionally and all of that, and then how that reflects what you're seeing in the textbook. Anywho, hopefully this helps. That is that. And yeah.